here at Department of Commerce, and I'm going to turn it over to Liz here to get us going.
Thank you, Emily. Good morning, everyone. My name is Liz Reichart. I am a Senior Energy Policy Specialist in the State Energy Office at the Department of Commerce. I want to warmly welcome you to the kickoff of the rulemaking for the second phase of the Clean Building Performance Standard, required as part of the passage of Senate Bill 5722, which was passed back in 2022. Next slide, please. Many of you are likely already familiar with the Washington State Department of Commerce, home to the State Energy Office. Can we go back a slide? Can folks hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Many of you are likely already familiar with the Washington State Department of Commerce, home to the state's energy office. This slide represents our agency's purpose. Commerce touches every aspect of community and economic development, from serving communities by providing grants for homeless programs for small businesses, building infrastructure, growing the economy, to promoting public safety. Here at Commerce, we strengthen communities. Next slide. Before we get going, there is an absolutely incredible team that works to advance the Clean Building Performance Standard here at Commerce, and you'll hear most of them today on a variety of subject matter. As I said at the top, my name is Liz Reichart. I'm a Senior Energy Policy Specialist at Commerce, where my focus is on buildings and energy efficiency. You heard from Emily Salzberg, who's the Managing Director of the Buildings Program. I'm wondering if I can pass the floor to Nick Manning for a quick introduction.
You certainly can. Hey, everybody. My name is Nick Manning. I'm the Legislative and Rulemaking Coordinator at the Department of Commerce. So I'm coming out of crazy session time and now thinking about transitioning into this great rulemaking process that we're going to kick off today. Great to meet you all. Next would be Danielle.
Hi, everybody. I'm Danielle Sigel, and I'm the Clean Buildings Administrative Assistant here at Department of Commerce.
Yep. I'm Luke Howard. I'm the Clean Buildings Technical Lead. Olin.
Good morning, I'm Anna Lindbergh again. I'm the Outreach and Communications Lead. KJ?
Hi, I'm Kyungjin Lee and go by KJ. I am a data lead of the Clean Buildings team. I am mainly working on Clean Buildings database and portal. Annika?
Hi, my name is Annika McDonald. I'm the Clean Buildings Incentive Program Lead for the Tier 1 and Tier 2 program. Donnie.
Hi, I'm Donnie Westfall. I am a technical specialist with the Clean Buildings team. Judy.
Judy Durst. I am the Clean Buildings Performance Team, technical. Brittany.
Hi there, Brittany Wagner. I'm a commerce specialist and I mostly focus on the appliance standards. Aaron?
Hi, my name is Aaron Dumas. I'm the program manager for the Clean Energy Fund Building Electrification Grant Program.
Great, thank you all. And I will say at the top that we are recording this. We will release the recording. We will release slides afterwards on our webpage and through the Clean Buildings Bulletin. So all of these materials will be available to participants. Next slide. Let's take a quick step back and briefly review the role of buildings in the state's greenhouse gas emissions. Buildings, as I'm sure participants know, have a profound impact on the environment. The building sector is the state's second largest carbon polluter behind transportation. As Washington's population has grown, greenhouse gas emissions from buildings jumped significantly from 1990 to 2015. Existing buildings create unique challenges and opportunities as the state works to meet its greenhouse gas emissions limits by 2030, 2040, and 2050. The 2021 State Energy Strategy, which was an economy-wide analysis that examined how Washington meets its emissions targets, found that investment in building energy efficiency is the most cost-efficient way to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the building sector. The Washington State Legislature recognized that it is in the state's interest to maximize the full potential of energy efficiency standards, incentives, programs, and codes to keep both energy costs low and meet our greenhouse gas emissions reductions and goals. Next slide. top, I want to situate us in the timeline that Senate Bill 5722 laid out for us. We will show this slide again after we've discussed 5722 and the work that bill prompts us to do through this rulemaking. But by the end of 2023, Commerce must complete its rulemaking for Tier 2 benchmarking, energy management, and operations and maintenance requirements. So this is where we're heading over the course of the year. Looking out into the future, the department is responsible for notifying building owners and launching an incentive program by July 2025. And Tier 2 building owners will be required to report to Commerce beginning in July 2027. You can see from this timeline that only in 2031 would an actual performance metric take effect. And we will get into all of these pieces later in the presentation. The important takeaway from this slide is that our rulemaking must be completed by December 2023. Next slide. And I will hand it over to Nick Manning.
Yeah, thank you, Liz. So zooming sort of into where we are now, trying to get to that CR 103 final rule that we can file by the end of this year. There are going to be a couple steps that we're going to go through, and I'm just going to quickly walk you guys through them. So the CR 101, the notice that we're kicking off a rulemaking process, that was filed back in November. And then between now and filing the CR 102, we're going to have 5 to 6 workshops, about one per month, that will each of them dive into a separate technical topic regarding the rulemaking. So for each workshop, we'll take feedback after for whatever the topic featured in that workshop was for 2 weeks. And then once all workshops are over, we'll publish a cumulative draft, which is the CR 102, and take feedback on that for 1 month before posting a final CR 103 involving a public comment period when the CR 102 comes out. And then the CR 103 will be the final rules, and we will be on our merry way.
Thank you, Nick. So our rulemaking workshop agenda looks like this. We have broken the rulemaking up thematically and planned for about 1 workshop per month. And after the final August workshop, the opportunity for public input does not stop. We will have open comment periods both before and after the CR 102 is filed. And I want to move to the next slide because, as Nick alluded to, both during and after each workshop, there will be plenty of opportunity for public engagement, input, and feedback on the draft language. You know, I want to echo what Emily said at the top. We really do want you to share your opinions and feedback on what we're doing here. Our goal with this rulemaking is really to be inclusive and participatory and make folks feel seen and heard in the final rules that are put forward. So I encourage you to show up. This is the process that each workshop will follow. We'll release draft text before the workshop. Public comment period will span 2 weeks on that draft text. You can also submit afterwards, but we encourage a 2-week public comment period. And then we'll follow up with a summary of public comments at the next workshop. We encourage folks to please be respectful, please show good Zoom manners by using the chat and using the raise hand feature before speaking, not only at the kickoff, but across all of our workshops. Next slide, please. All right, and I see a question in the chat about where the draft language will be released. It will be released on our webpage, and it will also be sent out through the Clean Buildings Bulletin. So if you are not already signed up for the Clean Buildings Bulletin, you can sign up on the Commerce Clean Buildings webpage. I will hand it over to Emily.
So thank you so much, Liz and Nick, for giving us an overview of the rulemaking process. We appreciate that. And Anna Lynn is going to be posting the workshop schedule that Liz just walked us through to the website here shortly. So we've got some dates that we're targeting for those, and again, would encourage your participation. So now we're going to shift into providing an overview of the components of the bill, Senate Bill 5722, which passed in the last legislative session in 2022. During the next portion of the presentation, we're going to be providing just some baseline information about Tier 1 buildings. So those are the buildings over 50,000 square feet, just for reference, but we are going to be primarily focusing on Tier 2 buildings. Next slide. Okay, just a real quick overview of the components of the law, all of which we'll go into more detail here shortly. So Section 1 covers the intent of the bill. Section 2 is definitions. Section 3 is requirements of the standard, and it also includes language around customer support and Commerce's obligations around technical assistance, information about penalties, so penalty fines for non-compliance, building owner notification, legislative reporting, and then sections 4, 5, and 6 are about the incentive program. Next slide. And I'll turn it over to Luke.
Right, thank you. So this slide represents, kind of summarizes the differences between tier 1 and tier 2 requirements. I'm going to go over the specific requirements of tier 1 and tier 2 in the next 2 slides, but I do want to point out here that tier 2 requirements. So buildings, tier 2 applies to buildings between 20 and 50,000 square feet. It will include benchmarking, energy management plan, O&M program. So the mandatory reporting date is July 1st, 2027 for the first cycle. We will complete the rules for tier 2 here by December of 2023. And additionally, multifamily buildings of above 50,000 square feet are also considered tier 2 buildings. Next slide, please. All right, so this slide highlights the tier 1 requirements. So there is benchmarking requirements that'll identify the building's EY. And then implementation of an operations and maintenance program and an energy management plan in accordance with the standard. Standard is based on ASHRAE 100 with state amendments to meet the intent of the legislation. So in addition to the 2 items or 3 items above, tier 1 does require a performance metric be met. This would either be meeting an energy use intensity target or meeting the investment criteria of the standard, which includes an energy audit and the implementation of all cost-effective energy efficiency measures. So the cost effectiveness is determined by Annex X of the standard and requires a life cycle cost analysis. There are also various exemptions, which is the compliance pathway. Those are outlined in section Z 4.1 of the standard. Next slide. Good. So this slide just kind of highlights the differences between the tier 1 requirements and the tier 2. So you'll see that benchmarking is still going to be required for tier 2, as well as implementation of an operations and maintenance program and an energy management plan in accordance with the standard. Next slide. This slide represents the timelines and schedule compliance dates. For tier 1, buildings over 220,000 square feet, the mandatory compliance date is June 1st, 2026. Tier 2, mandatory compliance date for all tier 2 buildings is June 1st of 2027. For the mid-range size buildings in tier 1, so these are the buildings between 90,000 and 220,000 square feet. Their compliance date is June 1st of 2027. And for the smallest cohort of tier 1 buildings, the buildings between 50 and 90,000 square feet, the mandatory compliance date is June 1st of 2028. I'll turn it over to Emily.
Great, thank you, Luke. And we did get a note in the chat for speakers to speak up a little bit. It sounds like it's hard to hear. So please let us know if it continues to be difficult to hear. We can adjust in the room so we're closer to the microphone. So thank you so much, Luke. You will, let's see, Liz reviewed the schedule a little earlier in the presentation. So just a couple items I wanted to reinforce. Rulemaking needs to be finished by December of 2023. We filed our CR 103 and again plan to do a series of about 6 public workshops. The reason we say about 6 workshops is because we may find the need to talk a bit more in detail about certain topics, in which case we'll add some workshops to the calendar to be thorough in that regard. By July 2025, Department of Commerce needs to have done building identification and building owner notification. So we're going to be going through the process of identifying what we believe to be covered commercial buildings and notifying building owners about the requirements of the law. And then we'll also be launching a new incentive program, which Annika will be talking about here shortly. As Luke mentioned, the first reporting requirement is July of 2027. And I want to really reinforce the July 2027 timeline really demarcates the first phase of implementation for this law. So tier 2 buildings, the requirements really are around reporting. It's benchmarking, operations and maintenance, and energy management. During this phase, there's not a performance standard that these buildings need to meet. So I want to be real clear about that, and we'll probably repeat that a few times throughout the presentation. So that first reporting requirement is in 2027. As we look to analyze the benchmarking data that we've received and understand a bit more about tier 2 buildings, Commerce will be putting together a report for the legislature and for the state to either recommend a performance standard or not. And we would then have authority to adopt rules for a performance standard by December of 2030. Rules would take effect after legislative session in July of 2031. So in the event that we do adopt a performance standard, that's what the timeframe would look like, adopting rules by December of 2030 and taking effect in July of 2031. Next slide, please. So I wanted to talk a bit about section 3.1 sub D of the bill. So this language does provide authority for Department of Commerce to assess penalty fines. Tier 2 buildings may have a penalty not to exceed 30 cents per square foot. So it's certainly a lesser penalty than our tier 1 buildings who are out of compliance. Penalties will be a topic that we explore in a future workshop, and we really would appreciate your input on how this is structured. Tier 1 penalties are structured as progressive penalties, meaning that Commerce can issue a lesser penalty, and we allow time for correction before the full penalty is assessed. We could take a similar approach with tier 2 buildings. There's a number of different ways we could approach this and would really appreciate your feedback on that. And again, that'll be a topic of a future workshop. Next slide, please. And I'm going to turn it over to Annika to talk about the incentive program.
Thanks. Sections 4 and 6 discuss the incentive program. So the incentive program for tier 2 is for completing that operations and maintenance, benchmarking your building through Energy Star Portfolio Manager, and doing your operations and maintenance plan. And those are the reporting requirements for applying to the incentive program. The program begins July 1st, 2025 and ends June 1st, 2030. So we have the workshop set for July to discuss the incentive program. We will be developing a new guidebook for the program and enhancing the portal for application to this program. The incentive funds are limited to 150 million. And the incentive for this program is 30 cents per square foot. The items that we are considering for this incentive program are equity and inclusion. So we are looking at rural communities, overburdened communities, and multifamily affordable housing. And this will all be discussed in that July workshop. Next slide, please. One slide back. So multifamily incentives. So my apologies, it's section 4.7, the department may implement a tiered incentive structure for upgrading multifamily buildings to provide an enhanced incentive payment to multifamily building owners willing to commit to anti-displacement provisions. We will be discussing this section in our July workshop. I also want to mention, as it was said before, this incentive program applies to not only multifamily buildings that are 20,000 square feet to 50, but it also expands beyond 50,000 square feet. So this is a really great incentive program that touches a bigger group of multifamily buildings. Next slide.
So for tier 2 buildings, Commerce will provide a customer support program to building owners. The customer support program must include enhanced technical support for Tier 2 covered buildings whose owners typically do not employ dedicated facility managers, including but not limited to multifamily housing, childcare facilities, and houses of worship. So the bill also requires us to prioritize under-resourced buildings with a high energy use in rural communities, buildings whose tenants are primarily small businesses, and finally, buildings located in high-risk communities. We'll be using the Department of Health's Environmental Health Disparities Map to determine high-risk communities. So utilities, the EPA, and organizations such as NEEC have been invaluable partnership with us, providing support to our Tier 1 building owners, and we hope to continue the partnership with Tier 2. So customer support and technical assistance are some topics for the next workshop. We hope you can join us and provide insight, feedback, and suggestions.
All right, next up, I'll cover the requirements around legislative reporting in the bill. And I'm noticing a couple questions that have come up in the chat regarding this. So hopefully that'll help clarify just a bit. So the bill states that by July 1st of 2029, the department, meaning Commerce, needs to evaluate benchmarking data to determine energy use and greenhouse gas emissions averages by Tier 2 covered building types. So the first reporting timeline for Tier 2 buildings is in 2027. So 2 years later, once we have a few years worth of benchmarking data, we will be doing an evaluation of that data itself, so we can identify energy use averages by building type for those Tier 2 buildings. We'll be compiling a report with recommendations for cost-effective building performance standards for Tier 2 covered buildings. The report needs to contain information on cost to building owners to implement the performance standard and anticipated implementation challenges. So this is language directly from the bill. So we will be doing that evaluation work between 2028 and 2029 and putting forward that report with recommendations to the legislature. I did see a question in the chat about the authority that Commerce has to adopt a standard. And it's my understanding we do have authority to adopt a performance standard for these Tier 2 buildings. However, the standard and the rules would only take effect after the legislative session following our rulemaking. So the legislature could take action in that event. So hopefully that clarifies a couple questions in the chat and provides an overview of the legislative reporting. Okay, and I got a little bit ahead of myself here. So this clarifies the dates. By December 31st of 2030, the department must adopt rules for performance standards for Tier 2 covered buildings. So following that recommendation report to the legislature, we would go through and we would do rulemaking just like we're doing now. And we would adopt rules. Again, just to clarify though, the rules would not become effective before the end of the following legislative session. All right, so next up, some information about a small business economic impact statement. So the bill as written does require us to complete a small business economic impact statement. This is oftentimes a part of the process in doing rulemaking and is explicitly stated in the bill. We're in the process of selecting a third-party consultant to complete this work. So we have an open RFP to try to find a consultant to do this work on our behalf. The contracted work is going to take place from July to September of this year. And the completed small business economic impact statement, which is also called an SBEIS, will be available during the CR 102 phase of rulemaking. And I'll turn it over to Luke.
All right. Senate Bill 5722 has added some language to the existing definitions to further clarify. We have highlighted a few of these additions in this slide and the subsequent slide. So 3B is the definition of building owner. And this new language adds the entity possessing title to the building on leased land. So the Clean Buildings Performance Standard is the responsibility of the building owner, and hopefully this added language further clarifies that. Also, as defined in RCW, Senate Bill 5722 has specified additional fuel sources in the definition of energy. So this includes including natural gas derived from renewable sources, synthetic sources, and fossil fuel sources. Next slide, please. All right, so net energy use is also a definition we use within the standard and has been expanded to allow credit to a covered building's EUI from renewable energy sources located on a campus, but not necessarily attached to that covered building. So current definition would allow a building that has a renewable energy source located on the building to deduct any exported energy back to the grid from the building's EUI. This new language expands that to allow for credits for renewable sources that aren't necessarily attached to the covered commercial building. Turn it over to Anna Lynn for a little information on the website.
Thanks, Luke. So currently there are several resources and tools available on the Clean Buildings website. What you see on the slide is the homepage where you can access a documentation library, which contains guides and tools to facilitate accurate interpretation of the standard, an FAQ page, a page for customer support and resources, and links to the portal and the incentive program. So the homepage is also where you'll find the Tier 2 rulemaking event information, the registration link, the comment form, and recordings such as this one in the future. So if you haven't already, visit our website to subscribe to the Clean Buildings Bulletin. We encourage you to subscribe to stay up to date. In the future, you'll see pages to support Tier 2 reporting. Next.
Clean Buildings Portal is a database for all covered buildings. For now, we allow access only to Tier 1 building owners to manage their building's compliance with our standard. And we are currently planning to build more reliable Tier 2 buildings database from many possible data sources. So we are not ready to collect Tier 2 buildings information directly from building owners. So please do not send Tier 2 building information and do not ask access to portal for Tier 2 buildings yet. For Tier 1 buildings, we send out notification letter with unique access code to the portal. And we have video guides on our website. So please take a look at them if you need any help to access and use the portal. By using our portal, building owners can view and verify their building information and assign roles to authorized parties and submit any applications. If you need any additional information or help, please submit a customer support form on the website. That's a brief introduction of the portal. And Liz?
Great, thanks, KJ. I want to get to your questions in the chat. Before we start answering questions, we have a lot of time for answering questions at the end. I want to do a little bit of group brainstorming around how we envision this rulemaking. And so I'm wondering if folks could respond to the questions we're going to put up on the screen by typing your answers in the chat and really sharing your feedback with us. So one thing we're thinking about is what are some priorities or guiding principles we should be considering going into this almost years-long rulemaking around Tier 2 buildings. So please feel free to type your answers into the chat, priorities and guiding principles we should be considering. I'll give folks a minute to do that. Workforce development and training, absolutely. Funding, huge question. Fuel switching. buildings with the greatest potential for improvements. These are great. Minimizing compliance costs, absolutely. This is great feedback. Thank you. I'm seeing a lot of questions around funding and prioritizing how we keep costs down and also are able to pay for it all. How we focus incentives on traditionally underserved communities. Great. Thank you for sharing this feedback, and may your answers continue to roll in as we share the next question for consideration. What ideas do you have to ensure an inclusive and participatory process? You know, we really want to, when we get to the stage where we're sharing cumulative drafts, we're filing final rules, we want those final rules to reflect everyone who participated in the process and really make folks feel seen and heard. What ideas do you have to ensure an inclusive and participatory process? I'll give folks a minute to type some ideas into the chat. These are great suggestions. Thank you for those who are sharing their ideas in the chat. Getting community-based organizations involved, absolutely. All right, as these ideas continue to roll in, I want to bring us to our third question for consideration. What are your aspirations for this expansion of clean buildings? I've seen trickles of this come in through the chat as we've been meeting. You know, what would you like to see from this second phase of clean buildings as we move to tier 2? What are your aspirations for this expansion? So feel free to put your ideas in the chat. We are taking all of them down. I'll give folks just a minute to put these ideas in the chat. Buildings that are cleaner and cheaper to operate and maintain. Reducing our GHG emissions. More funding to nonprofits. Greater clarity. Limiting cost impacts to small business. Great, well, keep the aspirations coming. These are all super helpful as we, you know, envision the next year of what this rulemaking will look like. I want to move to the next slide so we can start addressing some of the questions we got in the chat. And before we jump into questions, I think we got a couple of questions in advance that we'd like to address at the top. Nick, do you have, there was a question around, I actually have this question up. I'd be happy to ask it and someone on the team can field it. We got a question in advance around, will there be assistance in helping us determine are consumers that fall into this tier 2 category? We were previously provided a listing of buildings over 50,000 square feet. So this question is around assistance in determining tier 2 buildings. Anyone on the buildings team want to take that one?
Okay, we're unmuted. I'm happy to start with that. KJ, I'd invite you into the response along with anybody else from the team. But yes, we are required to do building identification and notification, again, with these tier 2 buildings. So in our process for identifying tier 1 buildings, we started with county assessor data, and then we layered in a number of different publicly available data sources. Our process was not perfect. We learned a lot through that. And really took a broad approach to building notification. So we sent letters to all building owners that we believe to be covered commercial buildings. Some buildings, building owners needed to come into the database to do some data corrections. We found that some buildings maybe were 49,000 square feet and we had identified them as a 50,000 square foot building. So we really expect an iterative process again. So to answer the question, yes, we will be notifying building owners and likely doing that through a combination of posting information to our webpage and then also sending information through the mail, hard copy letters. I don't know, KJ, anything you want to add or anything from the team?
Actually, we are trying to gather more reliable data from possible data sources. And actually, we have tabular public to display the number of buildings, parcels, owners for tier 1 buildings. So I will share the link for everybody here. Yep. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks for fielding that question, Clean Buildings team. I want to go back into the questions we received at the top of the presentation. There's a question around, will sample reports be available for O&M plans and energy management plans as we move into tier 2? Thoughts on resources that will be available?
All right, great question. And an area that we've heard a lot of feedback on is operations and maintenance planning and energy management planning, how helpful it would be to have a template for that. So that's definitely an item under consideration. Luke, I'm wondering if you want to talk a bit more about that. Can I put you in the hot seat?
Sure. Yeah, we recognize that, especially with the tier 2 building cohort coming on, that additional resources would be useful in helping these building owners develop and implement the energy management plan and operations and maintenance program requirements of the standard. So we are currently grading guidance documents and we look forward to determining new ideas or resources to help successfully implement those requirements of the standard. And through the tier 2 rulemaking process, we hope to engage with those stakeholders and get ideas from them of what would be useful and helpful.
Thank you, Luke. One question in the chat is around the early adopter incentive program. So you don't actually have to do projects to get early adopter incentive funding for tier 2, just benchmarking, O&M, and energy management planning. Annika, can you confirm?
That is correct. This is a reporting incentive for doing those 3 things. We will be developing the guidelines for this program and how to apply to it. And that will all be ready before July 1st, 2025, when you can apply to the program.
Great, thank you. And I'm skipping over a couple questions around authority that I think Emily addressed earlier, but feel free to resubmit those if you feel like those were not addressed. Notifications from Commerce were sent to landowners and not building owners. I'm assuming this is for Tier 1. Is Commerce going to send additional notifications to building owners?
We will do our best. And yeah, you're right. Based on how we were required to use county assessors data during the first round of notification, we found that we had many letters going to landowners instead of the building owners themselves. So that's an area where we're looking at just additional quality assurance on the data and additional data sources so we can better identify that. KJ, anything you want to add?
Yeah, so we are working on with commercial real estate data company to collect more reliable owner data so that we can send out notification letter to building owners more precisely.
Thanks, KJ. Question in the chat here about involvement of local municipalities and local energy utilities. How are the local energy utilities involved, and what is the role of local municipalities?
Arlen or Annika, do you want to start with this one? And then we can all kind of contribute? Or do you want me to do that? And then you can talk a bit more about outreach and incentive involvement. Okay, yeah. So I think how I would start in the response is like involvement of local jurisdictions and involvement of utility providers is critical to our collective success. We all really have a role to be supportive in not only increasing awareness and education about the standard itself, but doing everything that we can to support compliance. So what we found is utilities have, in some instances, created some new offerings. So they've been able to provide incentives or rebates for work that really complements clean buildings. There's utilities who have contributed to the cost of training for the workforce, which has been immensely helpful. We have local government that stepped in to help with getting the word out and doing some outreach and education about the standard itself. Some have incentives available, again, to complement the Clean Buildings Incentive. So that role of utilities and local government is really helpful for us collectively as a state to be successful. Annika, Annalyn, what would you want to add to that?
Sure. So I will, to echo what Emily is saying, we work really closely with utilities. Utilities are the mechanism for paying the incentive. So we will process applications, but we work with utilities to have the incentive paid directly to the account holder. And what's really great about our incentive programs is it is intended to complement other utility grants, state grants, incentives, conservation incentives. So it works really parallel. It's not just one or the other that you can apply to. You can apply to both. So we really encourage buildings to access all the available funding that's out there.
So just to add, currently utility companies greater than 25,000 square feet are, I'm sorry, but 25,000 customers are required to provide data using Energy Star Portfolio Manager using an automated upload protocol. That's for the utilities that serve 25,000 customers. But for the smaller utilities, right now, since the incentive program is voluntary, smaller utilities, it depends on their willingness to volunteer and their customers' demand for it, I guess. But for Tier 2, benchmarking is obviously a big part of compliance and reporting, and utilities play a big role with that. So hopefully in the future, we're going to have some kind of pinpointed work group to see how smaller utilities can support Tier 2 building owners, and we can have a discussion together and create a plan to support their customers and our stakeholders to provide accurate reporting.
Thank you, team. All right, a question in the chat. When will we receive info on identified buildings, building IDs and such? For tier 2, Commerce is required to notify covered building owners by July 2025. Anything to add on that, folks in the room?
Nope, you got it, Liz.
Let's scroll down to our next question. All right, love to see all of the great participation in the chat. Please keep it coming. All right, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, just looking for clarity on the mute button. Liz, I was gonna say while you're queuing up the next question, I did want to note for all the participants that we're likely not gonna get through all the questions. Y'all are welcome to hang out. We'll continue to field them until our scheduled time comes to a close. Any questions that remain that have not been addressed, we'll work to provide some responses to that and post a document to our website.
Thank you, Emily. Question in the chat. Seattle Building Performance is considering allowing public entities with large portfolios to consider portfolios as a group in greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Could Commerce model this on tier 2 buildings? Thoughts on portfolio compliance?
Okay, and Liz, I'm going to ask that you repeat that. We had a loud vehicle drive by the office.
All good. Seattle Building Performance is considering allowing public entities with large portfolios to consider portfolios as a group in greenhouse gas reduction. Could Department of Commerce model this on tier 2 buildings?
Yeah, that's a great question. And thank you so much for bringing that up. And I will just very transparently share that it's a tricky question. The Clean Buildings Law is written to require compliance at the building level, and it's based on site-based energy use intensity for tier 1 buildings. So we recognize that that gets complicated and challenging for campuses and complexes of buildings, and then also for building owners that own multiple buildings that maybe aren't connected through a campus or complex, but they have a portfolio. So we continue to have discussions with the city of Seattle and how we can align our standards to ease any kind of administrative or reporting burden. But there is just really, unfortunately, some realities of how the state law was written and our ability to align with Seattle's approach in that regard. Many of you, I'm sure, have been tracking House Bill 1390 that's been making its way through legislative session that has been underway right now that looks at district energy systems and does have a little bit of language in there that allows us to look at multiple buildings connected to one district system. So that'll be interesting to see how the outcome of 1390 settles. That'll be a topic, if that bill is enacted into law, that we will consider during either this rulemaking or a subsequent rulemaking to take that into consideration. So long story short, it's a challenging issue. We recognize issues with portfolios when building owners own multiple buildings, but unfortunately the Clean Buildings Law really is written to require compliance at the building level. Anything you want to add, Luke?
No, I think you covered it pretty well. You know, we can, we will continue to consider this and like Emily said, follow, the Seattle's legislation development and see if there's ways for us to align a bit there. There may be some reporting provisions we can allow on a portfolio level, but that's yet to be determined.
Thank you all. Queuing up the next question regarding on-site solar. Why is on-site generation of solar in energy use? How is this going to incentivize anyone to install solar? Clarity on on-site solar from someone on the team?
So the intent is within the standard as it, the tier 1 rules as it is a EUI is developed based on the net energy, site energy for the buildings. That's all energy imported in, minus any energy exported out of the building. And that would, that exported energy is intended to address site-based renewable energy generation that is not used directly in the building. The EUI is already credited for renewables used directly by the building, and the fact that it has to import less energy, so in effect reduces the EUI for the building. But any energy of excess or exported back to the grid can be deducted from the EUI calculation for the building. So you will be getting full credit for renewables associated with the building. And as the new tier 5722 language for net energy allows this to be applied to renewable energy sources on a campus that are not necessarily directly attached to a building, but you apply that credit to a building's EUI. Hopefully that provides the clarification that the
Thank you.
questioner wants.
Thank you. That definitely clarified, and in fact, kind of reversed what I had misunderstood when I first read that. So thank you very much.
All right, question from the chat. How will renewable natural gas use be accounted for in EUI? Any benefits, or do full RNG therms BTUs still get counted towards EUI? I just want to remind folks that this rulemaking does not develop EUIs in itself. Thoughts from the room?
Yeah, just one quick clarification as it applies to tier 1 buildings. The performance standard is based on site-based energy use intensity. So renewable natural gas, electricity, propane, it's all based on BTUs per square foot per year.
Thank you, Emily. Another question, are you aware of utilities requirement within the WACs to not always supply exact meter data until 2, 4, or 6 months, or sometimes greater after the billing month? And is this additional 6 months taken into account in compliance timing?
So that timeline is not, or that maybe delay isn't the right word, but that's not taken into account in the compliance timeline. But I do want to note that there's a year's worth of usage data that's required, but it's within a larger time frame than just 12 calendar months. So it's 12 months of usage data within
2 years.
2 years. Go team. Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, it'd be 12 consecutive months of consumption data within the 2 years prior to the compliance date is where the EUI should be developed from. So that should alleviate some of the issues with delayed delivery of consumption data from the utility. We're not aware of this being a big issue, but I can appreciate that it is a possibility. So if you have unique situations when it comes to that, please reach out to Commerce directly and we can discuss it.
Thank you, team. Will the energy management plan templates discourage the installation of combustion appliances that we know need to be removed before 2045 in order to meet the state energy strategy goals? Thoughts on energy management plans and what they will or will not contain?
I'll start. So the Clean Building Performance Standard is essentially fuel blind, so it does not encourage or discourage specific measures based on the fuel source. So the energy management plan requirements, as according to the rules and based off of ASHRAE 100, is the same. It does not encourage or discourage one fuel over another. We think it's important if a building is subject to other state or local laws that require electrification or greenhouse gas emission reductions, that they pay attention to those other standards and understand how it applies to Clean Building Performance Standard compliance.
Thank you for that one, Luke. All right, how are industrial building operations being handled? And I assume this is talking about tier 1 and then what we might do in tier 2. Any thoughts on that?
So industrial buildings are exempt from the requirements of the standard, and that would follow as well for tier 2 buildings.
Yeah, so to be clear, exemption is a compliance method. So you still need to apply for exemption, provide documentation of the building occupancy classification. So industrial would include manufacturing group F or factory group F as defined by the Washington State version of the International Building Code, or high hazard group H. And there's also an exemption for agricultural buildings as defined in the standard.
And speaking of exemption, can you please describe where Commerce is at with implementation of the exemption process for tier 1?
If you want to do a quick overview of our emergency rule and what that covers. And then we can talk a bit about where we're at with implementation, because I think that the timeline piece is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So in February, Commerce recognizing that applying for and receiving exemption decisions in 1 year, that timeline was not enough to apply for and receive an exemption decision. Either you're complying with the standard for exemption or you're not. As written in our rules, we filed an emergency rule wherein Commerce can now accept exemption applications 3 years prior to scheduled compliance date for tier 1 buildings. What that means is if you have a building that is in the first round of compliance, which needs to comply in 2026, you can begin to submit exemption applications July 1st, 2023. And we are currently working through a process to make that emergency rule permanent. And so it will apply for the rest of tier 1 buildings. Implementation side.
Thanks, Liz, for giving that overview. And yeah, we're very hopeful that by extending that time frame, that gives building owners a bit more certainty earlier on in the process. So yeah, we're hoping that's a benefit. From an implementation standpoint, some of the exemptions are a bit more clear cut than others. Vacant buildings versus semi-conditioned or unconditioned buildings, et cetera. But there is the exemption for financial hardship. That is one of the areas where we're looking at a bit closer and working to create some guidance around documentation that building owners could submit around financial hardship. So we're in the process of developing that guidance, going through legal review, and we'll have that information available prior to July 1, 2023 for that first timeframe for buildings to apply for exemption. And it will be buildings over 220,000 square feet. Team, anything you want to add to that implementation of exemptions?
The exemption application for tier 1 will be available through the Clean Buildings portal. So if you're not connected to the portal just yet and you plan on applying for exemptions, please connect with Commerce. our email address is on the screen.
Great, thank you. Back to House Bill 1390 concerning district energy systems. Are we assuming that 1390 would apply to both tier 1 and tier 2 district energy systems at our campuses?
Liz, do you want to field this or do you want me to?
Yeah, I think the answer is pretty straightforward. My assumption, my understanding of the bill is that it would apply to both tier 1 and tier 2.
Yes, our understanding is consistent.
Thank you.
All right, another question in the chat. How are tier 2 reporting incentives granted? Is it on a first come, first served basis?
Yes, the incentives are on a first come, first served basis, but we are looking to divide out that 150 million into different buckets of funding for accessibility. And that's what we'll be discussing during the workshop in July. So it's not, as a whole, it won't be a first come, first serve because we are identifying groups and prioritizing groups. So there will be some portion of it that will be a general application that will be first come, first serve, but we understand that some buildings may need a little bit more time. So we will carve out funding to give that flexibility in applying to the program.
Annika, do you want to give a quick overview about the incentives for tier 1 and the feedback that we heard about equity and inclusion?
Sure. So for the tier 1 incentive program, this applies to buildings 50,000 square feet and greater. The incentive for this program is 85 cents a square foot for meeting a performance-based target. So for buildings who want to apply to this incentive program, it's 75 million. This incentive is once again paid by utilities directly to the account owner of the building. So we have divided up the funding, the 75 million, into half. So 37.5 is for general application and the other 37.5 is for equity and inclusion. So we are using the Washington Health Disparities Map. We have identified multifamily affordable housing as well as one of the groups and the highest energy users. So buildings who have an energy use intensity that is 25 above its target, they would be considered within this equity and inclusive reservation of funding.
Yeah, thanks, Annika. So that would be an area where we would love to get further input on as we move through these rulemaking workshops. As Annika mentioned, the incentive program for tier 2 buildings is 150 million. And there's a number of different ways we could approach that to ensure that all building owners have access to the benefits of that funding. So certainly an area where we'd like some more input.
All right, another question. How is square footage determined if a complex has multiple buildings? For example, school with a separate gym building and portables. Are the sizes combined only if the HVAC system is shared? Please provide a rule of thumb because that'll determine if certain buildings fall into a tier 1 versus tier 2 category.
You want to take this or do you want me to?
Yeah, I can take it.
Okay.
So as the rules are written, this standard is based on is focused on the covered commercial buildings. So any building over 50,000 square feet for tier 1. There is also a provision within the standard that defines a building complex as a group of buildings interconnected through conditioned space on contiguous property. So when that's the case, you may have let's say a school with various wings that may have been built at different times, but they're interconnected with each other. That would be considered a complex, and as the rules are written, it can be pursue compliance at that level. So all the gross floor area for all the connected spaces would be used in development of the EUI and compliance for the building or building complex. Commerce has recognized that K-12 in particular, these campuses are typically have these portable buildings that are not interconnected with the rest of the buildings and most likely are not sub-metered, so that you can't really disaggregate out the energy consumption of these portables or disconnected buildings on a K-12 campus, for example. Which creates some complexities. It really is not the intent of the standard to require K-12 schools to sub-meter these portable buildings in order to comply with the EYT path of the standard. There are alternatives to doing that, as the rules are written, is to pursue the investment criteria, perform an ASHRAE level 2 audit on the covered commercial building on the K-12 campus, and implement all cost-effective energy efficiency measures. So those costs can be similar to sub-metering of spaces. In addition to that, the energy use intensity targets developed for K-12 schools is based on a campus-wide level. So Commerce has developed some guidance for K-12s that would allow for compliance at the campus level, recognizing the issues that I just spoke of. We are hoping to codify that through this tier 2 rulemaking process. But we would advise any K-12 schools that are considering these issues to contact us independently, and we can discuss the individual issues with compliance. Emily, do you have anything to add to that?
That's great.
Thank you, Luke. Another question in the chat. Has Commerce developed guidance on the lighting survey section of the energy management plan?
Yeah, so there's a couple things I want to talk about here, and I think I can hit both of answer the question when I address both of these. There's a lighting satisfaction survey requirement within the energy management plan of the standard, and it refers to measurement and verification protocols, a standard that is behind a paywall, so you have to pay for it, and then it's a multi-page survey. We understand some of the barriers to satisfying this requirement in the standard. So we're hoping to provide an alternative lighting satisfaction survey through this rule, tier 2 rule development. We hope to develop that. Perhaps we can have something available prior to early compliance date of July 1st, 2023. So there will be alternative. We hope to have an alternative there. The other one is a lighting schedule requirement based on a luminaire level. We have been working with the NEEC, Northwest Energy Efficiency Council, and Smart Building Center, as well as some of the local utilities on developing a lighting schedule that is a little more updated from, or it basically will be a tool that should be fairly user-friendly to satisfy the requirements of the energy management plan there. So that tool is under development. It's quite a long ways down that road of development. We've gotten quite a bit of feedback. So we hope to have that live here within the next couple of months and available for folks to use for satisfying their energy management plan requirements. There's also some consideration of creating an alternative or an allowance that if a building meets the EYT of the standard, that detailed lighting schedule would not need to be submitted to Commerce as part of your compliance documents. However, we do recognize a lighting schedule is a very important feature of energy management planning. And buildings that are not meeting the target, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit for them. There are a lot of incentives and resources that utilities provide and to encourage lighting energy efficiency measures. So more to come on that. Any discussion during the appropriate times of rulemaking over that would be, or even through an email to us at Commerce on your thoughts would be useful.
Thank you, Luke, for illuminating us on the lighting survey. A question from the chat: will Tier 2 have the same exemption rules as Tier 1?
Happy to start with that. Yeah, so those exemptions that apply to Tier 1 buildings likely will flow to Tier 2 buildings as well. That being said, if there's other items we should consider or additional clarification we ought to consider through rulemaking, that'll be a topic that we discuss in an upcoming workshop. But yes, those same exemptions would apply for Tier 2 buildings.
Will there be additional portfolio manager assistance available for benchmarking? Who are the contacts for benchmarking Q&A?
So we have a guidance document on the Clean Buildings portal if you look. So we have a guidebook we are revising that will go onto the Clean Buildings portal that outlines the benchmarking process. So the portfolio manager, Energy Star portfolio manager actually has a really great guide and a video for how to benchmark your building. There are some nuances with the Clean Buildings program where we have a Clean Buildings specific ID that you could identify, and it gives us the ability to share and to have your information downloaded by Clean Buildings. But what I will do is I will post in the chat the link to Energy Star's benchmarking guide. It provides the video, and we will likely work with the Energy Star folks to schedule some webinars on the benchmarking process. They are a really excellent partner with Commerce, and they have participated with us and other webinars. So we will likely partner with them and have some ongoing webinars for walking through the benchmarking process. And then we will also provide technical assistance through the Clean Buildings email address. So if you need any further assistance with benchmarking your building, we are happy to walk you through the process and schedule a Teams call where we can go through it together and make sure that you're understanding the step-by-step process. So we will have webinars, we will have videos, and we will also provide some support directly to those who need additional assistance.
And Annika, just a quick plug for our next workshop, which I believe is May 18th. We're going to be covering customer support, outreach, and technical assistance. And so that's a great opportunity for us to hear more about really what's needed to support the industry and to support building owners. So if that's an area where we need to have some enhanced technical assistance available, we would love to hear more about that and learn about that need. So feel free to attend that workshop May 18th, and we would love to hear more from you about that.
Thank you. Another question about exemptions. If a building is on a parcel that is identified as industrial, will it automatically fall into the exemption category? And a follow-up to that is, when will that exemption form be available?
So the exemption is based on the building occupancy classifications issued by the local building department. I'm assuming that there are going to be industrial buildings on industrial sites that have building occupancy classifications other than factory group H or factory group F and high hazard group H. The exemption process will be open on July 1st. of 2023, so this summer. And we'll have all the proper guidance documents for that process available by then.
To be clear, it's for tier 1 this summer. For tier 2, we have yet to have that. We're going to have that conversation to see what that process will look like.
Thank you both. Approximately half of the buildings in the state will be required to lower their EUI to align with their target. This will lead to a substantially lower usage median for all building types. Will the owners be required to comply with new targets at some point? I'm guessing this is for tier 1.
Yeah, I'm assuming that is referencing tier 1 buildings, because I do want to take a moment to clarify tier 2 buildings will not have a performance target that they need to meet at this point in time. So yeah, in terms of the tier 1 covered buildings, those are buildings over 50,000 square feet. And just, by order of magnitude, that's between 11 and 12,000 buildings here in the state of Washington. We're still doing quality assurance on the data, still working with building owners to fine tune that number. But just by order of magnitude, it's between 11 and 12,000 buildings. We expect that basically about half of those buildings will need to make some improvements in order to comply with the standard and become within reach of the targets that have been set by building type, or to pursue the investment criteria pathway that we talked about earlier. No, anything y'all want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question, Commerce is directed through the legislation to reevaluate at 5-year cycles whether the targets should be reset or not.
Thank you for that answer. All right. Someone asked about HOA barriers in multifamily. That is a very real thing. I am working with a potential multifamily project where the HOA rules are inhibiting most energy efficiency and renewable projects. Also, who would have to pay if not in compliance for a condominium project where there can be so many owners? And I want to throw it to the room in a second, but I think this will definitely be a topic of conversation as we go through rulemaking and we talk about how Commerce assesses penalties.
Yeah, Liz, I think that's a great response. And the only thing that I would add is we don't know yet. We do recognize there's some specific challenges and barriers for condominiums and multifamily building owners. That'll be a topic that we'll explore and work to craft rules or potentially exemptions that are reasonable and balanced given the intent of the legislation.
All right, I'm seeing one more question in the chat. Folks, if you have questions, please feel free to put them into the chat. This one is specific. When establishing your multiplier, the guidance essentially states open to the public at or below 40 hours per week or 50 hours on up, etc. K through 12 will most likely see their facilities operating in that 50+ hour per week category, though technically their doors may not be open to the public. Of course, we feel the additional runtime is essential to daily operation, allowing us to serve our constituents. So will there be an issue with utilizing the 1.1 multiplier when establishing the EUIT?
Well, as the rules are written, you've alluded that the shift normalization factor is based on hours of operation, and that's year-round average. So if the school is not having those same operation hours in the summertime, or maybe they have extended hours for portions of the building, or like evening youth sports programs or community events, that can all be factored into this average operating hours. We do understand and appreciate the concern about the shift normalization factors, in particular K-12 schools. All those concerns were considered when our consultant determined the energy use intensity targets for all building activity types, as well as the shift normalization factors listed in the standard. So those were addressed when developing the shift normalization factors.
Thank you, Luke. Last call for questions. We're also happy to take your questions at any time. If you email buildings@commerce.wa.gov, that email address that's up on the screen. We also have a guidance document library at the Clean Buildings webpage that's available on your screen, full of helpful resources that may answer questions as they arise. Seeing no further questions, I will advance to the next slide. Just wanted to plug for folks that our first workshop in earnest will be May 18th. It will be focused on customer outreach, technical support, and energy benchmarking for Tier 2 buildings. Anything to add from the room?
Only thing to add from my perspective is thank you all so much for your participation. Big thanks to the Commerce team to field so many questions and presentation content. We really look forward to future workshops and discussions and partnering with you all. Thank you so much.